Okay.
Hi there. We are going to come together today for about an hour to just dig into the practices that we're finding are imperative for student-centered coaching, or really any coaching model, to take off and thrive and get the results we're after. So I'm Diane Sweeney, and I'm the author of Student-Centered Coaching and Student-Centered Coaching: The Moves. I've been working with a lot of the AEAs, and so is my team, on supporting the TLC initiative throughout the state. And we thought that it would be nice to provide a resource to school leaders, particularly principals, to give us, or to give them, some strategies and some new thinking around the leadership side of coaching. So just a little bit about context and why this is important. We are finding that if we don't have a really strong system of leadership for coaching, I'll be honest, it's missing the impact that we're looking for. And we need principals to make coaching work. There's no other way to say it. And we need principals in a way that's truly a partnership and that's strategic and that aligns with our school improvement plan and that does so many things. It's almost a little bit scary to put that on principals because I know they're so busy. And I think on some level, we've really neglected school leaders when it comes down to the whole TLC initiative. It's not that people aren't supporting coaching. It's not that it's not happening, but there are definitely inconsistencies that we're finding in the schools where there's a lot of alignment and strategy and partnership between the TLCs and the principals. And then we're finding a lot of schools where TLCs are looking for more support. TLCs are looking for more guidance. The coaching model might be a little bit muddy. The perception of coaching among teachers might be unclear. And all those things really minimize our impact of coaching. So today I thought we could talk about a few different things, strategies that really support a principal to lead a coaching effort and to build that partnership with their TLCs. And so in the chat box, you have a few different links. If you've come on late to this chat, I know a few people are coming on as we've started. You have a Google Doc to sign up. You have a Google Doc that will be referenced through this chat. There's a link to some slides. And then Green Hills also has a Google Hangout. So there's some materials in the chat box that you can, or a Google space, that a collaborative space that folks are using, sorry. So as we dig into the core practices, I'm going to share my screen. And I thought it would be helpful to make this really clear, to really just dig into these as some moves that principals can use to lead coaching, particularly student-centered coaching, since a lot of folks in the state and in Green Hills AEA and other AEAs are using our model for coaching. So our metaphor today are trying to get all the fish to swim in the same direction. This is how we really create conditions where there's a partnership in place. Another great metaphor that I've heard recently is the idea of how geese fly in a triangle. And so if geese are in a triangle flying along, they're getting lift from one another and they're getting energy and support and momentum from one another, whereas if one peels off from the rest, it really makes it exhausting for that one geese. So we don't want anybody off on their own in this work. It is way too big for that and too important. So that's really our kind of our reasoning for the day, is trying to get all of us swimming in the same direction when it comes to a coaching model. So one of the first things that we find is important, and it's kind of one of the first moves, so to speak, is that we really find a lot of confusion out there in terms of what is even our approach to coaching in our particular school. What is our coaching model? it's amazing how many folks call us, our consulting team and our organization, and say, wow, we have coaches, but we don't have a coaching model. And we're not really sure if it's not consistent, and nobody's really sure exactly what the coach should be doing. And writing a TLC grant certainly may have gotten some schools closer to having a coherent coaching model or an approach that's coherent to the school. But I dare to say that a lot of the grants didn't even get us to that place of absolute coherence and a vision for an approach that we can commit to. So that's really the first move, is to get absolutely clear on your approach. What is coaching in your school? What do you really hope it to be? So that you can line up all the pieces from there. So many of you who have worked with me, some principals hopefully who are gonna, or anybody who really is gonna jump onto this webinar at any point, may not know this language, but those who have worked with us do. And we have identified three approaches to coaching that we think really have very different outcomes. And so this is a great place to start when you're thinking about, what is coaching about for you? What do you really want it to look like? And these are universally applied approaches. I don't think I'd call them models because they're not that explicit and that laid out, but they are really how coaching looks in a lot of schools and districts. And so we have, the first is relationship-driven coaching. And this is when we play it really safe with coaching. And sometimes schools do this, or school leaders go to this place of, let's just make sure we build relationships in the first year. Or let's make sure we create the conditions where nobody feels threatened by coaching. So what it really looks like when a coach is relationship driven in their work is they are much more of a resource provider. They're probably very helpful to teachers and certainly doing good work when it comes to providing resources. But what we find is that the outcome of that is very minimal, because what happens is the coach's time is spent intermittently, primarily in classrooms, maybe sometimes, not very focused, not goal-driven, not measurable in any sense of the word. And so it becomes very soft in its impact. And I would dare say that this is a dangerous place in terms of, trying to create coaching that has value that's understood universally. So by your school board, by your superintendent, by your teachers. We need coaching to make a bigger impact than relationship-driven coaching can. So the way, our goal with relationship-driven coaching is for the coach to be helpful. That's not enough when we, in our opinion, when it comes to making an impact. And I'm going to reference a document in a second that lays these out even more in detail. But let's just talk about the other two. So teacher-centered coaching is probably the most common approach to coaching that you're going to see in many schools, in many books on coaching. It really came from the Reading First era and the No Child Left Behind era, because so much of coaching in those times was attached to implementing a program or using certain materials. If you were in schools at the time during, for example, Reading First, you experienced the flood of new materials, whether it be everybody's getting classroom libraries or everybody's getting a new program of some kind. So then what happened is a lot of folks decided, well, we need to hire a coach to help folks implement these things. And so coaching became very teacher-centered and very program-focused. And the perception of teacher-centered coaching really is that they're there to get people to implement things. And oftentimes you hear the word fidelity attached to that, or we used to at least. So if you have a new program, a new reading series, a new math program, a new system of support for behavior, and you're trying to get it to be implemented, oftentimes the default is teacher-centered coaching. Now, it can make sense at times to take this approach, but thing about this approach that creates issues with perceptions and relationships is it can feel a bit evaluative to teachers. And teachers can feel like, wow, the coach is in here just telling me I have to do this thing and I have to do it in this particular way, and measuring whether or not I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. So we find that teacher-centered coaching is the hardest place for coaches to build relationships, because it's a place where coaches are a little bit elevated above teachers and they're there to hold them accountable. So it's okay to use any of these practices, but the thing is you got to be aware of why you're landing on either one, any of these, and what the kind of potential effect might be. So we measure teacher-centered coaching by measuring whether or not things are being implemented. We also kind of think that's a little bit soft, because we want to measure coaching based on whether kids are learning, whether students are achieving at higher levels with a coach in a classroom, with a coach partnering with teachers. So we like to go even further and deeper with coaching than teacher-centered coaching. We like to take it to the student-centered place. So with student-centered coaching, we coach goals around student outcomes. So with a teacher-centered coaching program, you would be coaching goals for teachers. So teachers will do number talks, or teachers will teach fluency in this way. Well, with student-centered coaching, we flip that and we make the goal about kids. Students will. What do we want students to know and do? That's what we coach into. And then we coach towards student achievement, but we also can coach instructional practice, because it makes absolute sense to say, hey, if we're going to coach students to be able to write an informational essay, then we need to talk about what instructional practices we're going to use to get there. So we can fold instruction and learning together into a student-centered approach to coaching. So we can measure it based on those two things as well. We can measure student-centered coaching based on whether or not, or to what degree the kids are learning to write an essay, or to solve multi-step problems, or whatever it is, and how the teacher grow. And so when we think about committing to your approach as our first move for leading a coaching effort, this is a big piece to think hard about. Which of these coaching approaches do you really want to go after? And knowing that at the front end is going to help you make a lot of decisions that come. So in your in the chat box, I provided you, and I'll show you what it looks like. I provided you a Google Doc that has, and the coaches who've worked with us have seen this, but this has exactly what I said laid out in much more depth. So you can see that the arrow on the top really shows us we're going to make more impact if we go after coaching in a way where we're designing it to measure student outcomes and to coach into student outcomes. And then you see that your least impactful form of coaching is relationship-driven coaching. So if you're interested, this is always where I start with school leaders, because this really helps you make some pretty important decisions around what do you want your approach to be, and being honest with everyone in the school about why you chose and which approach. And then also coaches need to know straight up what they're being asked to do and what the coaching model is. So that's the first big, let me figure out how to get back. Here we go. So that's the first big coaching move we recommend. We also really want to think with you about this idea, and this is, people always tacitly say that coaching is not supposed to be evaluative, and I think we all agree that coaching is not supposed to be evaluative. But there are a lot of times we run into situations where coaches are being asked to do things that do feel evaluative, that feel that we don't intend it to be. It's not evaluation in the formal sense of a observation with feedback that's written up and put in a file. It's not that kind of evaluation. But sometimes coaching can feel like, or the roles or the jobs or the duties a coach is asked to perform may feel a little bit more evaluative. So when we say separate coaching from supervision, we really look for very discrete lines in the sand when it comes to this. And we have to be honest with ourselves that coaching isn't going to solve every challenge in a school with instruction. There are going to be certain situations where teachers need more than coaching, where teachers may be honestly not meeting the needs of students, or not teaching to the level of rigor and expectation we're looking for, or really struggling with managing classrooms. And there are, we like to think about that as an off-ramp to supervision. There's a point when the principal needs to kick in those mechanisms that are those supervision mechanisms that are in schools and were in schools long before TLC to handle those situations. So we want to be really judicious in what we ask, the problems we ask coaching to solve, and the problems we think supervision can solve. And I have a fun story about that. I was working with a high school principal here in Denver, Colorado, and he has a team of coaches. And he said to me, I said, what are you doing about those teachers who really are struggling, who you're really in your heart, you have concern about? He said, I coach them. He doesn't coach in a traditional sense of the word, but he said, they're mine. Those folks are mine. I'm not going to ask my team of rookie coaches who are brand new, just hired this year, to crack nuts that that are way bigger than what they have in terms of sphere of influence, in terms of strategy. So I love to hear that, because that's what we want to hear. We want to hear school leaders being very careful to think about what coaching can support and what supervision needs to handle. So a couple thoughts on that. We really like to think a lot in terms of strategies. We like to build a lot off of Fullen's work. And Michael Fullen is really, it's so simple, but it's such an important idea when it comes to change theory. And it's that pressure and support are both really important when it comes to any change initiative. So we just apply this to coaching, and it so directly applies to coaching that there's pressure that comes from the supervision side of a school system, and there's support that comes from a coaching side. You can call this good cop, bad cop if you want, but the notion is that we put the principal on the pressure side, and the coach on the support side. So practices then align in that way. So you're thinking about, well, we could, set clear, and this is really a couple strategies that follow really go after this. So I'm going to just pin them to that notion. And I'm going to jump down actually to the third bullet and speak to that for a second. Because one major part of the pressure side of the continuum, or the pressure side of the equation in schools, is absolute clarity on expectations for instruction. And that needs to come from the school leader. That comes from the principal. And when you think about it, we get very lost in this in schools. I hear it over and over and over again. I don't think that we do a very good job of letting teachers know with absolute certainty, maybe 5 instructional practices that a school leader wants to see all the time happening in classrooms. Those things that rise to the surface in effect, that rise to the surface in being good, just good for kids, that create rich learning for kids. And so if I were to think of myself as a school leader, if I were in that position and I was thinking, what are those instructional practices that if I walked in any class in my school, I would want to see happening? It would be things like, I want to see continuous formative assessment. If you're not doing that, then we're not meeting the needs of kids. I want to see differentiation. I want to see small group instruction that's built off of that formative assessment. I want to see kids talking a lot so that they're uncovering and really going into their deep learning and processing as learners. I want to see teachers modeling with precision, and I want to see learning targets being used. Those are 5 examples of really high leverage doesn't have to be those 5, but I just wanted to give you some examples of what, when I say instructional practice, what I mean. Those are the things that make a difference for kids. And you can see if you narrow it down, even you may even choose to pick 1 or 2, and you may go after formative assessment for a whole year with your school and set a clear expectation that this is what I expect to see in classrooms. This gets us away from the whole idea of teachers as independent contractors. There's teachers who sometimes show up and think, hey, I shut my door and I have full autonomy. And I'm going to say that's not the way it is anymore. That can't be the way it is anymore, because there's way too much research on what good instruction looks like. Can teachers have a lot of choice and creativity in how they implement those instructional practices? Absolutely. But there's a minimum expectation around certain instructional practices being used throughout a school. And when that expectation is clear, and then when that expectation is set by the school leader, coaching just takes off, because the coach then can support the teachers to implement the thing that the principal is saying is an expectation. So you can see how those two things work together. Now, this seems so obvious. It seems like, how could a school not be set up that way? But there's a lot of schools where teachers have open-ended choice on what they want to do, or there's not clarity on what research says, or possibly there's micromanagement happening where teachers are told to follow a script or follow a program line by line by line. Well, that's not what we're talking about here, because that's setting expectations for following a program, which is not creating a vision for instruction. That does not do the job. That does not create an understanding of how to flexibly and thoughtfully use the research-proven instructional practices that we know are good for kids. So we really want teachers to have some ownership, but we want expectation to be sitting right clear as day within the school community. Clearly defining the coach's role is a strategy that helps us separate coaching from supervision. We always recommend a very simple practice, which is a principal and a coach sit down side by side, and if you have more than one coach, you could do it together. You could pull model classroom teachers or mentors into this as well. Create a Venn diagram or a 3-way Venn diagram and figure out, honestly, who does what? Where's the school leader in terms of leading this effort? What are their responsibilities? And what's the coach's job? What's their role? And then any others? And then where's the overlap? What are we sharing in terms of our shared responsibilities? We find that doing that work really helps a school define the coach's role. And then we also want to recommend to have really be careful about walkthroughs or learning walks or any other evaluation type processes that we see in schools. And the reason why we think coaches should be not necessarily in that mix well, there's some exceptions. I do want to mention that. And this is how I look at it. I look at it like, if there's a checklist involved, if there are people coming in to check whether teachers are doing what they're supposed to be doing, then we don't want coaches in that process at all. Unless they're in the classroom working with teachers at the time, that would be okay. But anything that's designed to check implementation, that involves checklists, that involves whether teachers are following, the guidelines, that is clearly a supervision. And that lives, in my opinion, solidly on the school leader or the district leader's plates. The exception would be if you have learning walks or instructional rounds processes that are very much built by the school community, that are not about checking if people are doing what they're supposed to be doing, but rather digging deeper to reflect on practice. That would be more in the instructional rounds definition. That's Richard Elmore's work. I think that's okay. So we have to make a careful choice here. If the purpose of the walkthrough is evaluation, then that's not we don't want coaches to be in that role. If it's shared learning and building learning, certainly a coach can be in that role. But that's something just to be thinking about when we think about this bigger move of separating coaching from supervision. And check in consistently with the coach on this, because we want to make sure they feel like they're in the right, being positioned right, and being positioned in a way that's building trusting relationships with teachers. We can't really talk about leading coaching if we don't speak to culture for a few minutes. And culture is obviously going to dramatically impact whether or not a coaching effort thrives or not. We see in schools in Iowa, we see a few different examples of school culture. We see schools that have really collaborative and rigorous school cultures where coaches just find a really easy path. We find a lot of schools, honestly, probably the majority of schools, have a friendly school culture, as Todd Whitaker would say, maybe collegial, maybe collaborative, but not in a deep, rigorous way. I think that's probably your most common culture in schools that we find, particularly in the TLC program schools we work in. So that's a tricky place for a coach, because coaches tend to end up in a relationship-driven coaching mode in schools where they're friendly but not really rigorously collaborating as a school culture. So we like to recommend to school leaders to think about setting the expectations that the culture is highly reflective, is challenging one another. You may have to set norms. We love the 7 norms of collaborative work, which you can Google, or I can add to the Google Doc. But those are really some nice norms that get at sorry, my landline is ringing, but I never answered anyway. So, but the 7 norms of collaborative work really get at not just show up on time and, be attentive and bring snacks, but it's really how deeply are you reflecting in collaborative work? How are you really listening and probing one another? And those, if you're in a very kind of congenial school culture, you may think of those as a structure that could, or a set of norms that could really push your teachers. A couple other things for leaders to think about when it comes to building a culture that really sets coaching up to succeed is we really have to work hard to maintain an asset-based perspective towards teachers, meaning we always want to help principals avoid thinking about their staffs through the lens of, well, there's this one group of teachers who are fine, and then there's another group of teachers that I'm worried about, so I'm going to have the coach focus on those teachers I'm worried about. We wouldn't call this an asset-based perspective. We'd call this a deficit perspective towards certain teachers, and everybody is onto that, and it doesn't necessarily set a coach up for success, because what happens is those teachers really push back, whether they do it discreetly, or they just sort of fake coaching, participation in coaching, or they may just be literally resistant to the whole thing. So what we believe is a strong move for a leader to make is to look at a faculty through the lens of everybody has room to grow. We certainly have some superstar teachers on our staff. We certainly have some teachers who have, maybe newer to the profession, or may have some important learning to do, but we all have room to grow. We all have that improvement, the need to improve, everybody in a school. And the way that supports coaching is then, if that's clearly conveyed to a school, and the one way we say you can convey that is saying, coaching is for everyone. Coaching is not for certain people. Coaching isn't just for the newbies. That term's been common lately. It's not just for the new hires. Coaching isn't just for the strugglers. Coaching is for everyone, and that's that asset-based perspective. It's that we're looking at everyone as having strengths in our school, and we're looking at everyone as having room to grow. So that message needs to probably be repeated over and over again so that people come to believe it. And then also we have to truly follow suit with our actions. So we have to then not assign a coach to fix certain people, not tell teachers you need coaching because you're on a plan, not assign coaching to just the new teachers, because that sends a message that of a deficit approach to coaching, that coaching is for people who need help. And that then undermines the coach's ability to work with other people. Because imagine in a school, if everyone catches on that it's a sort of us being coaching is being assigned to the less proficient among us, then why would I engage as a model classroom teacher, or why would I engage as a teacher who's middle of the road solid and could certainly use coaching? So we find that we like to set the expectation, and we work with coaches who work with us on developing systems to literally reach every teacher in a school. We try to go after everyone in a school with coaching, not certain people. And that's that real asset-based perspective. And it's really this notion of we're a culture of learners. We also have to oftentimes remind school leaders that this stuff is going to take time, that it's really messy, and we're talking about improving instruction. We're talking about moving kids, and man, that's not quick. And I think about myself as a teacher and how complex and demanding being a good teacher is. And so having a little bit of patience with the coaching effort, but also pushing it to be rigorous. That's the sweet spot we're really after. We also want to, we want to give coaching time. We don't want quick fixes. Coaching can't be a quick fix. Again, it's too complex. Teaching is too complex. We'll talk about some ways to go deep with coaching in our last move. And then we also say, when it comes to school culture, building a collaborative environment is really, using protocols is really a great way to build collaboration and to move from maybe a congenial school culture to a much more collaborative school culture. So I think a lot of schools have lost this as a priority, and we're seeing that a lot of schools can make enormous growth in terms of the intentionality and the really having any collaboration teachers are doing in smaller, large groups being much more rigorous if we just pull out a great protocol and stick to it and really take this time seriously. This builds our school culture and says, we're here to do important work. So when you have PLCs that are sitting around and not using protocols, go back to that. That is super important. I'd recommend in terms of collaboration, a great new book that a colleague of mine wrote called Leading Impact Teams. And Leading Impact Teams it's written by Paul Bloomberg and Barb Pitchford. I'll add the reference to our Google Doc. But it really provides amazing protocols for collaboration time that are very student-centered. So protocols that always embed student evidence, that always embed formative assessment, that always go after what are the teachers going to do next in their classrooms as a result of this collaboration time. So we can simply up the ante with some great protocols, no matter what they are. So that's a big strategy when it comes to school culture. I have two more that I just want to speak to, and then we'll see if there are questions, and we'll use the chat box for that. Setting the expectation for participation is a big question that we get often from school leaders. And the question often comes up as, should coaching be mandatory or should it be invitational? And if you've read any of my old books, I was thinking more on the invitational side because of the school culture, because of building relationships and trust. But I really think we don't have to choose between whether coaching is mandatory or invitational. I think we can really think about coaching, like I mentioned earlier, as being for everyone. So we create systems with coaches. We help them decide how to structure their work because they need help with that. It's not the same job as being a classroom teacher. And we help coaches figure out, how am I going to develop systems where I can literally touch every teacher in a school? And so we think about coaching as invitational much more than as either mandatory or we think about it as, inclusive more than invitational or mandatory. So by inclusive, what I mean to say is it's for everyone in a school. And so here's a few things we can think about when it comes to setting expectations for participation from a leadership perspective, from the school leader's side of the desk. So first things first, we have to get people to participate in coaching for the right reasons and knowing the intentions behind it. So we suggest thinking about Simon Sinek's work here, which is really the notion of starting with the why. Why is student-centered coaching worth your time? Why should I care? Why should I do it? Why should I participate? Why should it even be sort of on my radar as something that's important? And so when a principal can convey the why, and it's not the way we normally think to do it. Normally we think through the how. We think a principal's job is to stand up and say, or they help the coaches do this, to stand up and say all the ways that you can work with a coach. Here's all the things we can do together. That's not necessarily how we engage adults. We engage adults with the why. So for example, my why with coaching is I believe coaching is essential because it's about impacting student learning every day. That's my why. So thinking with your coach, sit down with your coach and draw out Simon Sinek's golden circle like you see here on the slide with three concentric circles and the why in the middle, and really unpack that why and think to yourself and talk through with your coach, what is our why? How are we going to sit down and talk to teachers and remind them over and over through the year, not just in the fall, but consistently go back to that why. Why does coaching matter? We work with coaches to create from that conversation to create all kinds of vehicles to initiate and enroll and gather teachers into the coaching process. But we need for the principal and the coach to get clear on the why before any of those next steps can happen. We also really want to, the last move, which is our fifth move and our last move, is to expect coaching cycles. And this one we are hardcore about. If you work with us, those coaches who have done any training with any of my team, know we're going to say, are you in cycles? Are you in coaching cycles? How are they going? What's your impact? How are you measuring them? What are you going to do to get your next round going? What is your schedule looking like? How could you do more coaching cycles? We push and push and push for coaching cycles. And there's a few reasons for this. So for us, a coaching cycle is a 4 to 6 week long partnership where a coach and teacher, or even a small group, maybe 2 or 3 teachers, work with the coach. They set a goal for student learning. They figure out what's the success criteria. What is that going to look like for kids to reach that goal? So let's use the example of writing an informational essay in 6th grade. So let's say our goal is to write an informational essay. That's the student goal. That's student-centered coaching always starts with a goal for kids, and the coaching cycles always start with a goal for kids. Teacher-centered coaching starts with a goal for teachers. The teacher will do X. We start with a goal for kids. So that's the entry point for a really robust coaching cycle. And it's the entry point for a coaching cycle that's going to be measurable. And that's what we're after. And that's why we expect coaching cycles, because it's our most measurable and impactful work a coach can do. So just to walk you through the rest of the cycle, in case you don't know these details, a coaching cycle then also, once you have your goal and you have your success criteria, which tends to be a collection of learning targets, the coach and teacher work a few times a week for the remainder of the coaching cycle to co-plan and co-teach, co-plan and co-teach, co-plan and co-teach on a weekly basis. So the coach is in classrooms a ton. They're planning with the teachers. We often say teachers don't plan. Well, this is a way to scaffold up planning. And then at the end of the cycle, we really look and see what was the student and teacher growth. And we have mechanisms built into our coaching cycles to pre and post assess and to gather data on how did the kids grow? What was the impact made here? And how did the teacher evolve in instruction? And if you think back to that move I mentioned earlier of having a clear set of instructional expectations, a few things that you hope to see happening in every classroom, you can see how a coach can build those right into a coaching cycle. And so this is our most impactful work. This is the work coaches do that leaves behind the biggest impact. So we hope to see coaches actively engaged in these. And if you sit down, we would recommend sitting down on a weekly basis or every few weeks with your coach and asking them, how are your cycles going? Who are you in cycles with? We don't think coaching has to be confidential. We want coaching to be something we celebrate in a school. So a principal and coach should be able to talk through, how are the cycles going? Who are you in cycles with? Who are you going to pick up in the next round and do cycles with? Can I help you with anything? Can I get into any of the classrooms and just see what's happening with your coaching cycles? So you see what kind of partnership we're after. But none of this is going to happen if coaches aren't expected and nudged to get into coaching cycles to start with. If they're floating around, and I'm just going to be kind of honest here, if coaches are floating around doing very nebulous work where they're here and there and everywhere and not necessarily going deep with any teachers in classrooms, if they're not in classrooms very often, if they're just a resource provider, that's a red flag. A principal needs to know that coaching can be far more than that. And so we need principals to set that expectation and to help coaches do deep and measurable work with teachers. So a couple nuts and bolts with expecting coaching cycles. I think a full-time coach, somebody who's in one school coaching and doesn't have tutoring or other classes they teach or interventions they give, a really highly dedicated coach in a single school can do about 4 coaching cycles at a time. And remember, those aren't all with individuals. That can be with pairs or 3 teachers. So feasibly, if a coach is fully being deployed, they can coach 7, 8 teachers at a time. And then we recommend they wrap those cycles up, and then they pick up another round of coaching cycles. And then they do those 8 or so teachers, 9, 10 teachers, wrap those up, and then pick up their next round. And you can see by using that strategy, coaches can impact a lot of teachers very deeply. So that's kind of a nutshell in how we support coaches to develop and schedule coaching cycles. But what we need is that expectation to be in coaching cycles, because sometimes coaches tend to be a little shy about initiating this kind of stuff. So we really want to, hold teachers accountable to also be engaging in cycles. We don't want this to be about compliance. We want to give a lot of choice and ownership to teachers so they can choose how are they going to engage in coaching cycles. So we work with coaches also on developing really choice-based systems around this stuff. And an example of that would be, hey, I'm going to be doing cycles for the next month or so. Would you like to join this round or the next round, which will start in December, or something along those lines? That makes it not about compliance. So we don't think it's the best strategy for a principal to say, everyone's going to do a cycle. You must do a cycle, but rather frame it as your coach is going to be doing a lot of coaching cycles this year, and we're going to give you a ton of ownership in how you engage in those cycles. So you can see how different that is, and we're really reaching the adult learner in a much more respectful way if we give them some autonomy in how they engage. But remember that pressure and support, we need to put pressure on them to engage in the first place. And then how they engage, they get a lot of ownership in. So that's that little delicate dance of pressure and support as in relation to coaching cycles. Last but not least, we really want coaching principals to affirm and celebrate coaching cycles. So when they're wrapping up, we'd like to have coaches have them wrap up kind of all around the same week span of time, and then you can do a little blast of celebration. Put it in your principal memo. Do some shout outs in your staff meeting. Hey, Amanda was in a coaching cycle and her kids learned how to retell text, and they are, really retelling and going much further with the assessment, and they're doing so much great work. And if you want to see Amanda doing retelling, we can set up a visit into her classroom, but you can celebrate and build on the successes. But if coaching this is why I don't believe it should be confidential. If coaching is confidential, then it's hidden in the shadows, and we can't affirm and celebrate. And building coaching up to be a much broader based initiative that's everybody in a school, that's inclusive, really demands for us to affirm and celebrate the impact it's making. Otherwise, it's going to have a negative sort of sense attached to it. It's not going to be viewed as being relevant to all teachers. So one last thing about scheduling coaching cycles is since we schedule them in these rounds, we always tell coaches to make sure they have really highly proficient, highly respected teacher in a cycle, and also a maybe new teacher in a cycle. Maybe not together, but at least having both on their schedule sends a message that coaching is for everyone. We also have a coach we work with who's been starting to do partner cycles. And I just want to mention this, particularly in Iowa, because there's a lot of mentor teachers, model classroom teachers. And this has been a great strategy. That is, she partners up a veteran and like a mentor teacher with the mentee, and does a coaching cycle with them together. Nobody's held up to a higher level in that coaching cycle. They're both viewed as co-learners, but you can see how that can take mentoring to the next level. So there's a lot of ways we can organize coaching cycles that really create that vision of coaching is for everyone. So I've given you guys a lot of strategies around leading coaching. This is stuff we've already talked about. There's a resource I want to mention, and then I'll see what questions you have. And the resource, it's all just on the same Google Doc, so you don't have to jump around. I mentioned the continuum is there. I also included the core practices for student-centered coaching, just so you know what coaches are doing in their day-to-day work with teachers. I think knowing these core practices is really incumbent upon the school leader. You don't have to know how to do them, but you have to know them so that you can hold coaches to high standards. I included a little bit more information on coaching cycles and what our process looks like. Again, so you know it, so you can lead it. And then I just think that there's a lot of room for us to be really intentional in the feedback we give to coaches. So on that same document, there's a link to this rubric for student-centered coaching, and that is a great tool. I'd recommend for school leaders to peruse this, to print it off, to bring it to your school, to your coach, and to have your coach set a goal around one of these areas. There's 7 areas that we think make an effective coach effective. This is a great tool for you to set a goal and have them really work towards that goal as the year progresses. So it's a vehicle for you to you could even use this to evaluate your coach. If you have no real good coaching evaluation tool, which a lot of people don't, you could use this rubric to evaluate. You can see it's very thorough. It has success criteria for each area. And it's a really, really useful tool for school leaders to either personally learn about what it takes to be a good coach, or to partner and give your coach feedback, or there's all kinds of ways you could use this rubric. So I just wanted you to have access to that. And this is one that we've recently revised, so it's the newest version. So on that note, I know I've promised we're close to the end of the hour. I'm going to try to get myself into the chat box and see. I'm going to unshare my screen. Let's see. This is always fun. And get back to the chat box if I can. Woo! I think I've got 2 browsers going is my problem. Let's see. Gonna Pause share. Stop share. Now I can see the chat box. I see the resources are there for everybody. In case you came on late, you've got all kinds. Oh, somebody posted the 7 norms of collaborative work. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I referenced that earlier. Would you just throw on any questions you have, and then I'll speak to anything that's left. And I'm going to scroll all the way down to the last, to the bottom, kind of to the 9:45-ish part of this, and see if anybody's wondering anything at all on how to lead the coaching effort. Sounds like we're good. Terry, I'm going to take that as a we're good. I threw a lot at you guys, but just hang on to these documents so that you can bring, I would recommend if you're the TLC listening, you can bring them to your school leader. If you're the school leader listening, you can bring them to your TLC and build the partnership from there. Thank you guys for spending an hour with me today. I know it's a busy time of year, and I hope that this was helpful. Terry, do you have any last words?
I just want to thank you for taking the time. I did record it, so I will upload this to YouTube and then send out the link. I'll get it shared out with anybody and everybody.
Okay, awesome. And make sure I get the link, and I'll put it on our website too.
No way.
Yes. Yay!
Of course I will.
Okay. Well, thanks,
right,
you guys. Have an amazing rest of the week. I know it's almost the 3-day weekend, so enjoy, and we'll hopefully see you all soon.
Okay, thanks, Diane.
Bye.
Bye.